Thank you. Just first, thank you also to everyone for all of their support and help in bringing me here. I feel like sort of unconsciously I've been a little bit more difficult than usual, which I apologize for, and I appreciate everyone's patience. And also going along with that strand of things, my talk is also a little bit long. It's a little bit too long, so after lunch, everyone's digesting, but I'll try to be a little bit speedy. Unfortunately, it's also written out, and thank you also to James for lending his computer to read from. In any case, I will just get right into it. As you've all read, the title is of the entire piece is Feelings Are Alternative Facts, and it's in 3 parts. Now, the first part is called To Be Unlawfully Overcome by Others. In putting this together, I kept unexpectedly coming on my sources, rediscovering things I'd forgotten into internalization, into authorship, things I've quoted elsewhere, things I've taught. This has been heartening, or at least seems in line with something of what I'll try to say today, about being a muddle of others, about not speaking alone whether I want to or not. Throughout this, I can hear Amy Simony, Misty, Kerstin Stockemeyer, my superegos du jour. In an email attempt to coax some friends into a book club from a few years ago, which failed, I had offered this bit from the Undercommons, quote, "What the beyond of teaching is really about is not finishing oneself, not passing, not completing. It's about allowing subjectivity to be unlawfully overcome by others, a radical passion and passivity such that one becomes unfit for subjection because one does not possess the kind of agency that can hold the regulatory forces of subjecthood, and one cannot initiate the auto-interpolative torque that biopower subjection requires and rewards," end quote. Regardless of my hesitations with some of Fred Moten's recent writing, I suppose these lines pretty much sum up where I'm going, or rather, I'll at least say that I'm happy he's here with us today, too. On January 2nd, 2017, I had class. I don't really remember, but I'll claim that that means that we talked about Kellyanne Conway and alternative facts.
To come out in front of the podium for the first time and utter a falsehood. Why did he do that? It undermines the credibility of the entire White House press office on day one.
Don't be so overly dramatic about it, Chuck. You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute. Alternative facts?
If it wasn't that day that we talked about this, and I have no idea with the time difference, et cetera, then certainly we did talk about it the next week as unwittingly the American election grabbed onto my seminar at the Kunsthochschule für Medien from its very beginning. The seminar was called Music, Mute Speech, and Material Intelligence and started in late October 2016, just before the election. The class was meant to be about, and this is from my course description, drawing a line between the histories of sonic construction and instrumentalization and recent writing on modes of non-linguistic signification. And so much of that class is also here today, not just its bibliography, but the students, our discussions, our goofy final group feelings radio project. Regardless, what struck me hard in that context was that so much of the reaction to Kellyanne Conway's demonic defense of Sean Spicer's idiocy seemed to fall into a trap, which is to say, who wants facts anyway? Hasn't our 200-year-long critique of representation, also known as modernism, been doing all it can to take apart and dismantle the factual, the transparent? So the situation seemed to me to warn of a baby and bathwater situation. The warning signs throughout the election campaigns had been unending. The constant, paradoxically misogynistic, feminizing dismissal of the Trump crowds as animals driven by emotions. If only we could just get back to good old rational critical discourse between equals, to civility, decorum, without those pesky feelings, that irrationality. Of course, that specific strain of masculinist realism, for old time's sake, let's just call it what it is, phallogocentrism, is, as we all know, also virulently present in the very same heroic modernism that I mentioned just a moment ago. For a bit of levity, maybe, from the recent, very brittle collection of his letters, John Cage writes to Yoko Ono in 1967, quote, "I am not interested in your bottoms project, nor in Charlotte Moorman's tops activities. This is not to imply anything more than I'm not interested, just as I'm not interested in Stefan Volpe's battle piece or in any other projection of fixed ideas and feelings and or including Lamont Young," end quote. So maybe I'm not talking about 100 years of critical representation work. Maybe I'm talking about 50 years, or 46 to be precise. 1972 is the year Yvonne Rainer, our art grandma, our art auntie, describes a turning in her practice away from the objectivities and rationalisms of the modern and postmodern worlds she'd been inhabiting up until that point. It's also her moment of turning to radical feminism, of reading both Valerie Solanas and Shulamith Firestone. Feelings are facts. The title of her 2006 autobiography is a phrase she lifts from her psychotherapist. Rainer writes, quote, "Ignored or denied in the work of my 1960s peers, the nuts and bolts of emotional life shaped the unseen, or should I say, unseemly underbelly of high U.S. minimalism. While we aspired to the lofty and cerebral plane of a quotidian materiality, our unconscious lives unraveled with an intensity and melodrama that inversely matched their absence in the boxes, beams, jogging, and standing still of our austere sculptural and choreographic creations," end quote. Did you all watch The People versus O.J. Simpson last year? In the last episode, the District Attorney Gil Garcetti character says something brutal. Quote, "We are all profoundly disappointed with this verdict, but it was clear to me and to the prosecution that this was an emotional case. And apparently the jury's decision was based on emotion, not on reason," end quote. After all that rich characterization, the studied citing of the situation in that insanely complex moment. But what is emotion, anyway, other than the sedimentation of meaning, practice, and history? Hyper-distilled, internalized, exposed to the raw complexities of memory of the unconscious. As deeply entangled with racialization, sexualization, and violence as it gets. And as such, thinking again of O.J. Simpson, wouldn't an authentic appeal to emotion be an appeal to a greater intelligence? Which would be the opposite of the case of Kellyanne Conway. The problem with the alt-right's alt-facts, and I only use this monikers for this stupid pun, is that they're an invested relativism, alternative only insofar as they allow facts to be instrumentalized. Alternative facts are mercenary, for whomever can pay whatever suits the invested case. When I say feelings are alternative facts, I'm trying to gesture to a whole beyond instrumentalizability, to a complexity that is contradictory, irresolute, singular, infinite, and nothing. Maybe feelings are facts alone even still has a whiff of minimalism in it, a bit of, well, if we add this to the palette too, then the system might finally be complete. Feelings are alternative facts makes no such guarantee, attempts instead to be committed to a radical, originless anti-stability of facts in and of themselves, a practice that would be absolutely irreconcilable with facile appropriation. Music is often asked to stand for the unspeakable, for a beyond, and that standing for performs major cultural work. This is why a while ago I wrote that if musicians had anything useful to say, it would be that music also works, can indeed be thought, spoken. In short, that it's not special. Feelings too, which is not to brutalize with demystification, the opposite in fact. The prospect of unimagined strength and intelligence in the articulation of emotion is the seed of what I dramatically called in my abstract for this talk an anti-fascist politics of affect.
300, bitch, that's the 10. 300, bitch, that's the 10.
One time on the beat.
In the field, we play for keeps. In the field, we play for keeps. 300, bitch, that's the 10. 300, bitch, that's the 10. OTF and TVE. OTF and TVE. 300, bitch, that's the 10. 300, bitch, that's the 10. Fuck nigga, you don't want no beef. Fuck nigga, you don't want no beef. In the field, we play for keeps. In the field, we play for keeps. OTF and TVE. OTF and TVE. 300, bitch, that's the 10. 300, bitch, that's the 10. Fuck nigga, you don't want no beef. Fuck nigga, you don't want no beef. In the field, we play for keeps. In the field, we play for keeps. OTF and TVE. OTF and TVE. 300, bitch, that's the 10. 300, bitch, that's the 10. On that money, sprint to that green. On that money, sprint to that green. 300, bitch, that's the 10. 300, bitch, that's the 10. Infrared, yeah, we love them things. Infrared, yeah, we love them things. My niggas thirsty, y'all love that 10. I love that thirsty, y'all love that 10. Ain't playing fast, so we keep them things. Ain't playing fast.
Stop that. On November 23rd, 2012, Jordan Russell Davies was murdered for listening to this song, Little Reese featuring Lil Durk and Fredo Santana's Beef, for listening to it too loud. His murderer was finally convicted in November 2016, just days after a man just like him became president of the United States. So much comes together around this obscene act of violence. The willfully unthought notions of music and emotion fester outward. A crude mode of subjectivity that can choose to kill lest it be exposed to contingency, lest its ears be penetrated against its will. Once, in an interview, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen says he believes no one should make a sound within audible proximity of another without explicit permission. Here, in 2012, that perceptual regime, that precise perceptual regime, hypercharged with the virulence of American anti-blackness, fully reveals itself for what it has always already been. Jordan Davis was killed by a mode of listening. Oops, let's go, how do you go back there? Okay, so the second part is called bottoming autonomy. How do we do this? Hate is a primal passion. We're hardwired for it and can never entirely free ourselves from its grip. Music loosens the feet or the heart, just as wine loosens the tongue. But such victories only testify to the weakness of the vanquished. To be the slave of unreasoning, undirected, and purposeless feeling ignited by a power which is out of all relation to our will and intellect is not worthy of the human mind. Words are but superficial dressings for the passions behind them. He speaks to the primitive, atavistic impulses of his supporters. They pay less attention to the propositional content of his words than to the non-rational sentiments behind them. Mankind is much more easily impressed by elemental forces in a primitive state of culture than later on, when intellectual consciousness and the faculty of reflection have attained a higher degree of maturity. Emotional reasoning confuses feelings with facts. It impairs our intellect and literally distorts reality. We as humans can stop and think things through with our intellect. Animals operate on instinct and impulse. It is well known that the action of music is most powerful of all in the case of savages. He growls, rants, shouts, digresses, careens from shtick nuggets to shtick nuggets, rhapsodizes over past landslides, name drops. When South Sea Islanders rattle wooden staves and pieces of metal to the accompaniment of fearful howling, they are performing natural music, that is, no music at all. But when a Tyrolese peasant sings, though apparently uninfluenced by art culture, that is beyond dispute artificial music. So I hope it wasn't entirely clear what that was, which was which. About half of this mess was from Edward Hanslick's 1854 On the Beautiful in Music, one of the most important and foundational texts on so-called absolute music, that is, on autonomous art par excellence. The rest was probably more obvious, recent-ish media writing from the center-left, mostly having appeared during the last American electoral campaigns. I keep trying to think of these guys as listeners, of this picture as a picture of reception, a picture of the pleasures of group receptivity. How many bottoms can the master's voice fill? But that the Trump rally is an exemplary queer space is only a secondary problem. The core question of this picture, and in a way of autonomy today, as throughout its brief history, is how to be receptive and be a subject. How to be an impenetrable, coherent, white, cis, heteromasculinist citizen subject and also receive. Receptivity, passivity, has plagued the heroics of the autonomous agent from the modern get-go, prompting blooms of defensive strategies of crowd discipline and activation. The historical sludge of those defenses are the problems of the Trump listener. That we know all too well how to assure ourselves that we can indeed be both receptive and propter subjects. That listening doesn't have to make us femme or savage, doesn't have to be, as Edward Hanslick says in the mid-19th century, pathological. The contemporary hypertrophy of these mechanisms for maintaining paranoid integrity goes so far as to cannibalize the very discourses of their critical theorization. Here, for instance, Julia Hahn, the current special assistant to President Trump and former protege of Steve Bannon, and the author of such Breitbart scum, this is the title of an article, as "Illegal Child Rapist Hillary's State Department Did Not Deport Shoots 2 Police Officers." Here this creature writes about and speaks about Leo Bersani.
Before I begin discussing Foucault and Freud, I'd just like to express how sincerely honored I am to be here. I spent all last summer reading Leo Bersani and found both his work and psychoanalysis to be hugely transformational in shaping my education. That's not to say that my love of Bersani's work hasn't come with some serious drawbacks and obvious negatives. For instance, in the dating scene, I've come to realize that you'll end up with a lot of unwanted follow-up calls and offers of second dates when you casually mention over dinner that you're currently reading a philosopher who encourages you to shatter your current form of experience by going out and having sex.
What complicates all of this even further, and is a corollary of the panicky disavowal of bottoming, is the paucity of historical studies of reception. Whether assumed natural or rational, it's as though widespread belief that a particular work or aesthetic practice necessarily implies its form of reception were still unassailable, as though an object's or performance's representation of radicality were somehow to conjure a parallel and equally radical mode of apprehension in its receiver. Even if Adorno demurs from the magical thinking of this assumption, his modernity announces a kind of negative version thereof, of appropriate or adequate apperception as impossible challenge. To properly hear Beethoven becomes a question of transcendence, of sublation, but more to him and that later. But that which is to be sublated in the Adornian listening, part and parcel with what I've been describing as defensive modes of active, read toppy receptivity, is the product of some 200 years of discipline, enforcement, and internalization. The naturalness of solely contemplating a work of art, of doing nothing but actively listening to a piece of music, is this product of centuries of policing. In an article on the toilets and lack thereof in English concert houses before 1830, Michael Burden writes, referring a lot to this incredible picture, quote, "The documented behavior of London audiences suggests that it had little or nothing in common with anything that might be experienced by opera-goers today. These audiences pushed, shoved, argued, and as a vomiting character in the illustration suggests, the crush could be tight." You see the vomiting person. Recorded incidents at the Opera House in 1830 included torn clothes and a few fainting fits, a Mr. Jones who was knocked over and crushed and emerged gushing blood from his eyes, ears, and mouth, and the positioning of fire engines at the stage doors in an effort to persuade the audience to remain under control. Also evident in the image is a row of spikes, the standard device for London audience crowd control. That's the end of the quote. This is just a little taste of the scene that will be transformed within something like only 40 years, let's say between 1790 and 1830, from this into the obedient, polite concert setting that we still occupy today. And in these 40 years, the bourgeois citizen, male and white, obviously needed to learn what a listening proper to his station would be. And as usual with new paradigms of knowledge, those lessons began with force. As F.W.J. Hemmings describes just before the French Revolution, quote, to ensure quiet behavior, an ordinance was established a military guard at the two comedies, consisting of about 30 fusiliers, increased by 1788 to 56 at the Comédie Française, 60 at the Opera, and 67 at the Comédie Italienne. They were employed inside the theater as well. In case of crowding, their orders were to shove together the occupants of benches without regard to complaints, end quote. But likewise, as typical, however, more subtle exercises of power proved far more effective. This Daumier caricature is of the figure of the claqueur from 1842, a bit later then, after the disciplining of the audience was a more or less fait accompli. With the pedagogical force of the claque no longer necessary, it could devolve into groups of shady mercenary characters like Daumier's, in which price lists like this circulate, and into cliques of connoisseurs, opera queens, say. But far more interesting to me is the claque as a central component of public institutions as it was in the first half of the 19th century. Perhaps most remarkably as incorporated into the official workings of the Paris Opera under the direction of Louis Véron in the 1830s. His renowned chef de claque, Auguste Levasseur, whose salary rivaled those of the house's main singers, employed a veritable army of claqueurs who were tacitly positioned among paying audience members to subliminally guide them in the appropriate reception of new work. Véron recalls, quote, if an opera or ballet that already had been performed several times had need of additional support, Auguste was accorded 40 or 50 seats. If it was a question of a previously acclaimed work that was guaranteed to draw a great crowd, he received only 20 or even 10. At every premiere, Auguste asked for and received at least 100 seats. On the day of a premiere, Auguste demanded that his army be admitted into the walls of Troy before the general public, because of Auguste's wise deployment, the public found itself imprisoned, so to speak, in the midst of the claque. Auguste was determined to emerge the victor of every battle, and when a work succeeded, he swelled with pride, crediting himself with the triumph. What a great success I achieved yesterday, he would say. That's the end of that. As cute as this may now seem, the exclusionary dimension of claquerie toward the establishment of the behavioral norms of the bourgeois public sphere are also sharply clear. For instance, as the romantic story goes, the 1830 performance of Daniel Auber's opera The Mute Girl of Portici at La Monnaie in Brussels, where I will be doing a little workshop on Wednesday, and I hope I will see some of you there, supposedly catalyzed riots that spurned on the Belgian National Revolution. La Monnaie and this.
Amour sacré de la patrie, l'amour, l'audace et la fierté. À mon pays, je dois la vie, il me devra sa liberté. Amour sacré de la patrie, l'amour, l'audace et la fierté. Je dois la vie, il me devra sa liberté. Amour sacré de la patrie.
Anyway, I'll stop that from. So this little rousing, delightful little tune apparently brought the government to its knees. What actually seems to have happened was that the bourgeois revolutionaries instrumentalized a large group of working-class men to spread the polite nationalist passion of the concert hall out onto the streets, after which their services and participation were no longer necessary or desired. The scholar Sonia Slatin describes the morning after the fabled concert revolt, quote, In mentioning the continuation on the 26th of August of the revolutionary events begun on the previous evening, the reporter of the Courrier, one of the newspapers that spurned on the riots, failed to report that by that very morning, noting that the lower classes, which had cooperated with the middle class in the revolt, threatened to gain control of the revolution, the bourgeois liberal leaders hastily formed a civil defense committee, thereby not only inaugurating the acting by means of which power slipped imperceptibly into the hands of the bourgeoisie, but maintaining their control over the rebellion in which they had played so prominent a role. End quote. So, long story short, in the first half of the 19th century, the audience learns to shut the fuck up and listen. Not just to follow rules, not just to be self-aware of behavior, but a full-on internalization of a way of listening that we remain with today. Obviously, though, this isn't enough. Taste and free speech are the unfortunate side effects of a crowd of proper citizen listeners, of a bunch of bros. If I'm totally not being passive and totally maintaining my phallic integrity in my proper way of receiving, then I totally have the right to mansplain. Which is to say, the audience shut up, but there was still the matter of applause, of the boo, the glorious binary horizon of Europe's sacred agonistic publicness. Now that I'm educated and listen, I'm going to tell you what I think. Now, my great little line, the modern listener was always already a total dick. And this brings us back to Adorno. On the very first page of his unfinished Beethoven book, he writes, quote, "From my childhood, I can clearly remember the magic emanating from a score. It was this magic, far more than the wish to know music as such, that induced me to learn how to transpose and read scores while still a child. So strong was this magic that I can still feel it today when I read the pastoral, in which probably it first manifested itself to me, not, however, when it is played. And that is no doubt an argument against musical performance as such." The question of hyper-autonomy in the work of Adorno's peers, Schoenberg, the Second Viennese School, drives the question of activized reception to new heights. The total rationalization of musical language suggested by 12-tone technique and the parallel irrationalization of the expressionistic gestural vocabulary in which that system was articulated brings both autonomy and reception to a crisis point. What to do if the hyper-coherence of the work's structure might only be internalized and audible 100 years down the line, as Schoenberg hegemonically pined? What to do in the meantime with work that only seems to sound exactly like masculine hysteria? Enter the Verein für musikalische Privataufführungen, the Society for Private Musical Performances, an organization that existed for only 3 years, founded by Schoenberg, a pedagogical format somewhere between listening at the point of a bayonet and the neighborly emulation of the Klack, and with ambitions far beyond both. From the Verein's founding charter, point number 6. Performances should be removed from the corrupting influences of the public. Members should not be encouraged to evaluate. The opposite is wished, to unlearn the habit of premature evaluation and to instead reach toward a true goal, attention. Because public evaluation distracts from this purpose, A, the performances are to be in no way public. Guests are banned. Discussion of the performances in newspapers or in advertisements for pieces or for people is forbidden. B, at the performances, all forms of applause and forms of negative or appreciative demonstration are banned. The only success that an author should have is that which should be most important to him, having made himself understood. End of that quote. Ironically or not, this is pretty much the exact same place and time that Freud is writing Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, a volume which, as usual with Freud, contra his own final analyses, is full of remarkably reappropriable and generative ideas. For example, his gapingly unresolved observation that, quote, "Where masses made up of men and women form, sexual difference plays no role. It makes almost no sense to ask if the libido which holds the mass together is of a homosexual or heterosexual nature, because it is not differentiated by genders and entirely abandons the goals of genital organization. It seems certain that homosexual love is particularly compatible with group bonds, even when it appears as an unrestrained sexual impulse, a strange fact, the explanation of which could lead quite far, and which he literally never follows. So the dissonance of Freud's polymorphous mass and the Verein's absolute constriction, both as a kind of prelude to emerging fascism and the coming war, bring us again back to the Trump listeners. To Julia Hahn's preemptive consumption of Leo Bersani. No, my friends, just desublimating the homosocial motor of this scene is not enough. That Milo Yiannopoulos might like fisting doesn't help. Acts of transgression have no implicit relationship to a politics. They do function, however, as rocket fuel for a post-ideological playing field. Or rather, as with historical fascism, there is a kind of boomerang effect of recapitulable transgression. Flexing the roided-up bicep of ingrained defensive receptivity again and again, all the way to the oh-so-many little deaths of vocal and manual ejaculation. Breaking the decorum of listening silence with proud enthusiasm in so many ways that Hector Berlioz's typology of applause pales in comparison. Trump operatively understands that the instrumentalization of pleasure has no bound but death, if even that. Trump operationally knows that the past 200 years of fake audiences and audience performance are on his side insofar as otherwise unthought and unclaimed, ensuring the recapitulability of however unruly he may push. Trump understands the power of detumescence, the power of going soft after excess, what happens where one is left after transgressing. Daddy can do anything he wants to get off as long as he's still daddy when he's done. The only perversion left would seem to be that of a non-heroic self-abolition, a total systemic destruction of the subject without a hint of martyrdom. But even this smacks of heroic anti-heroism, of putting an end to the inscriptive cycle of crisis and stabilization in one last ultimate explosion, more ejaculation. Even here, the anxiety provoked by receptivity must be dispatched, if not in the name of social reproduction, then in the name of antisocial sublation, antisocial annihilation. The terror of receptivity, unbound, would be of the subject's contingent dissolution, a dissolution that would bring him, his body, his subjectivity into a crisis of exposure to terms not his own, to potentially irreversible indeterminacy. This is where Hahn's use of Bersani ceases to surprise, where Bersani's shattering is just more liberalism. Heteronymous reception is bottoming without coming, without the assurance that I remains I after transgression, that the fun of losing oneself for a moment in art or sex or drugs or distraction might not come with the privileged assurance of return. The terror of receptivity is of contingent, unforeseen transformation. In this sense, then, to reach for abolition might be to reach just a bit too far, might still retain too much of a twinge of transgressive desire, however radical in form. Instead, the staging of or staging toward the crisis of receptivity and autonomy, the opening or tear into the unspeakable, the unforeseeable therein, would seem more than enough to articulate. But just this would require a dissection of all those modes of internalized, autonomized reception, the process of which we've barely begun. And then there's this last we. Would that be the we who can, quote unquote, only live in history, as at the end of Pasolini's Ashes of Gramsci? Can this be adequate, this logic of having worked through? Or is this one last catch, one last universalization of that subject who just won't go away? If autonomous art was a blip in the field of aesthetic practice, there's nothing per se romantic about reorientation. Of course, one could only do so as the mess that one remains. And of course, one could only do so with the means to risk a receptivity that might leave one transformed. But to cling to identity against impending appropriation is to miss the point. One also has to risk being wrong. The thought of reorientation, of being reoriented vis-a-vis other aesthetic practices, is not meant so much as an optimism as, or toward, a mode of passivity without release. The end of art, if anything, is not a whimper, but a humiliation. Now the third part. I hope I'm not wildly over time, but I'll try to be fast. This is not as long. The third part is called "It's Not Right, but It's Okay." Then again, we are never so consistent, so coherent, so homogeneous. This qualification, I hope, is not a retreat, but another formulation of what I've just said. Yes, those temporary states of exception alluded to, sex, drugs, distraction, are all eminently dismissible in the context of recuperation. At the same time, they're also all indexes of self-heterogeny. I can never be I, and to suggest otherwise, even negatively, would be yet another buttressing of that historical subject we're at work to dissemble. So what then are we to make of quotidian heteronomy, of our casual engagements and participation in other paradigms of aesthetic practice? How to talk about binge-watching Shondaland all night and being a zombie at work? How to talk about sexting at work and masturbating in a bathroom break? How to talk about all the highs that make days of obligation and indenture glide? And how to disambiguate the proximity of all these durational absences from reductive discourses of transgression or resistance, i.e., none of these things will get you per se fired or will make you want to quit your job. What one can instead point to here are ulterior forms of literacy. I cry more with Annalise Keating than with most of my friends. The spectrum of joy and humiliation involved with so many fuckboys on text and in hookups is far beyond anything in my quote-unquote professional life. Intoxicated, I improvises. The point is not that any of these things are more authentic or even somehow in and of themselves are valorizable. The point is that they are not me's in me, forms of reception that don't address me as such as a coherent, defensive, rational subject. They are forms of an at least nascent, degenerate reception, of, borrowing a phrase from the late German art historian Peter Gorsen, illegal intelligence. These silent capacities to feel and to move that are constantly cultivated and activated in the normatively oriented form world that surrounds us are precisely those that neo-fascist demagogues have cashed in on and which the left is all but incapable of even acknowledging. Yvonne Rainer, again in the 1970s, writes, "Having survived my various physical and psychic traumas and emboldened by the women's movement, I felt entitled to struggle with an entirely new lexicon. The language of specific emotional experience, already familiar outside the avant-garde world in drama, novels, cinema, comic books, and soap opera, promised all the ambivalent pleasures and terrors of the experiences themselves: seduction, passion, rage, betrayal, grief, and joy." Trump's entertainment factor, back to me, spoken of by so many with disgust, is not only a problem because it marks its subject's stupidity, but rather because it monopolizes address to this form of alternative intelligence. Then again, the sprawling precedents of new media and their total violation of historical distinctions of public and private are engendering receptive paradigms as radical as the shift into the classical concert hall and as rife for deformation. Their primary political valence is not to be found on either side of the electoral stage, but rather in that massive segment of the constituency of the population, in the American case 44.6%, who had better things to do than vote. Somewhere here I hear C.L.R. James writing that, quote, "If the middle classes are not helped by modern art to understand the new society, if the Hungarian Revolution had to create without the stimulus and explosive clarification of art, it is because of the very unprecedented character of the new society," end quote. So would the question be how to amplify the antisocial tendencies of our implicit heteronomy? Or does this once again take us back to abolition, to the all too sexiness of transgression? Two of my favorite Marianne Amiche bits, both of which I've probably recounted to some of you ad nauseum, seem to fit perfectly here. First, a note from the 1980s. She says, "I want to make a music that becomes popular, that makes people cry because it is unheard of. It develops too sensitive areas." And then a remark from an interview given just a bit later. "I think the oddest response I ever got to my music was in Vienna after one of these music for sound-joined rooms works. Someone said that they really questioned whether it was such a good thing to have music like this because maybe you wouldn't need anything else then. If you could just live in this experience, and maybe that wasn't so good socially," end quote. Amiche's notoriety, her sudden accessibility, think of her playing at Woodstock 94, or of all of the bands obsessed with her, is far from inconsequential. By reorienting the fulcrum of aesthetic practice to such too sensitive areas, we might read hers as a de-dramatized case of having left art in the specific autonomous neurotic sense for of, again, a degenerate, that is, excessive, ebullient, emulsive, disintegrative form of pop. Of course, I say this with a certain hesitancy, as what I mean has absolutely nothing to do with genre, but instead with the fundamental shift of relation to a receiver, how to address another. In the sense I mean, Diamanda Galas best clarifies. She writes, "Pathos in roles such as these is rigorous. It requires a superior virtuosity because it redefines what is considered to be behavior resulting from experience outside the confines of the normative human. The question here is not one of simplistic development of vocal virtuosity. Rather, it involves a redefinition of a most accurate sonic representation of thought via the most accessible, direct, sophisticated music-making apparatus," end quote. Almost done, I'm sorry. Materiality speaks. The violence and pleasure in a scream is articulate. The non-linguistic is historical, inscribed, and inscriptive. To work with such intelligence is the province of supreme discipline, all of which is contra the quasi-mystical and blatantly nationalist overtones of Roland Barthes' grain of the voice. In his terms, we might retain the distinction between Gino and Fino voice, but only registrally. The Fino voice would now likewise be the imprint of a culture, but formally, affectively, bodily, non-verbally. A shift, a reorientation of signification that is in no way neutral. On the contrary, this is precisely the origin of Gallus's politics. Research inward into the asignifying corners of the voice brings her to others, to the heteronymous presence of affects in abjection, horror, and extremity. But where I guess I hesitate one last time is that once more the avant-garde, we who can only live in history position of having worked through art to something else, brings us to something that was also already here. 14 years before Barthes' Grain, and long before Galas or Amiche's mature work, for instance, Ralph Ellison writes, quote, "When we listen to Jimmy Rushing's handling of lyrics, we become aware of that quality which makes for the mysteriousness of the blues. Their ability to imply far more than they state outright, and their capacity to make the details of sex convey meanings which touch upon the metaphysical. Rushing has worked out a flexibility of enunciation and a rhythmical agility with words which makes us constantly aware of the meanings which shimmer just beyond the limits of the lyrics. The blues is an art of ambiguity, an assertion of the irrepressibly human over all circumstances, whether created by others or by one's own human feelings." Here in the 1950s, then, a theory and practice of a historicized and absolutely situated signifier of sound's body, its nonverbal capacity, richly and complexly imbued with meaning and situated in a specific tradition exterior to that of European autonomy, that of which Arthur Jaffa has more recently referred to as immaterial expression. I'm not sure then how to hear Gallus's intersection with this tradition. For example, You Don't Know What Love Is, a track on All the Way, one of her albums she released last year. I'll skip the clip because it's no time. What is remarkable is that her dialogue with Holiday, with Billie Holiday, of course, who sang the original version, occurs solely in the register of Holiday's materialist virtuosity, her phrasing, turns of timbre, breath, all those sites Angela Davis underscores in her writing on Holiday, the blues, and black feminism. But is Gallas's abstraction, her exaggeration of these parameters, her breathtaking extension of these sounds, a necessary redundancy? Is she simply updating the legibility of antisociality in these timbres? Is such a logic of degeneration even appropriate here? For years now, I listen to Young Thug far more than to Gallus or Amiche. It would be relatively easy to wax poetic on Thugger's quote-unquote post-verbal brilliance, his extended vocal virtuosity, his hyper-productivity, at least earlier on, as life practice, etc. But that lessening, mine, partially at least, in the sense that my point in general here is that listening is never singular, is always already heteronymous, is also a problem, just as Gallus's of Holiday is a problem. But in that problem, I hear far more at stake than most anywhere else, or I just keep listening. I try listening to my listening. Maybe I enjoy, and maybe I move, and maybe I cringe at myself. Maybe that listening also isn't at all special. Maybe whether or not that's enough or not enough is beside the point. Maybe, if anything, the best I can do is to sing along with Whitney Houston, saying, "It's not all right, but it's okay." Thank you.